Learning Azure with Iain Foulds.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your humble host. Make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. And I have with me a really exciting guest today. Iain Foulds is a senior content developer at Microsoft. He's focused on Azure technologies, and he spent more than a decade in the field as an engineer building and running virtualization environments, including cloud solutions. He's been at Microsoft since 2014, and he currently supports and enables customers to successfully run workloads in Azure. And he is the author of the book, Learn Azure in a Month of Lunches, with second edition coming out soon. You can find him on Twitter at Fouldsy. That's at Fouldsy. Iain, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Very good. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to chatting for a little bit today.
Absolutely. It's great to have you on. And for the folks who might not have read your book, why don't you? How did you end up in your current role at Microsoft, and what's your career journey been?
Yeah, so a little bit of a roundabout way of ending up writing books and writing content, but I was an engineer in the field for about a decade or so. I started out in what you would probably call traditional sysadmin, sysengineer roles, doing a lot with server-based stuff, Windows Server, Linux Server workloads. Did quite a bit with Active Directory as well, and then started to transition into virtualization when VMware started becoming pretty big, 2006, 2008 time. That kind of took me through to the point where I ended up at Microsoft as a premier field engineer. So I was working with a lot of big customers based out of Houston, but traveled around central US area, doing stuff again with Active Directory or with Hyper-V, System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and then naturally kind of transitioned into Azure from there. And it was actually someone that I worked with in Houston, ended up moving to Redmond to do content development. And I was kind of curious as to what that was. And the more I looked at it, it's like, well, that actually sounds kind of cool, because now we get to work with the product team. We get to find out what's coming up new in the product, new features that they have coming out. And then we can kind of use some of that field experience that we've had to maybe give some feedback to help improve that before it comes out. But also then hopefully end up writing documentation that hits home more actual points people would want to use for real, rather than maybe it's a little bit more of a marketing message. So hopefully that resonates in some of the docs on docs.microsoft.com. And then the book kind of became something where I'd seen, we write a lot of good docs in terms of this is how you can set up this one particular feature, but we were kind of missing an overall story for someone that was new, in terms of I need to go through some kind of logical progression on how I tie these different Azure services together. And so that's kind of where the book came about. So the first edition came out about 2 years ago. Second edition is just wrapping up. It's going through production now. So it should be coming out sometime in April, hopefully. At least the digital version, print version, end of April, start of May, maybe.
Awesome. So a month, that means that you have either 30 or 31 points or topics, right?
Plus, we give you the weekends off.
Okay, so 20. So 20 topics.
Yeah, it turns out right around 20, there's 21 chapters. The first chapter is kind of a freebie just to help you get set up with an Azure free account if you need one. Everything in the book can be done within a free account. So you would have the 30 calendar days, I suppose, where you could go ahead and create these resources. And then there's 20 chapters that really then dive in to all these different topics. And the Month of Lunches series tries to keep it to about 40 to 45 minutes, depending depending on how generous your employee is with your lunch breaks. Some of the chapters we push a little bit longer when we get into artificial intelligence and machine learning, but everything should still be under an hour. But the idea is that if you've got about 40, 45 minutes to spare a day, and that could be lunchtime, that could be evening, you should be able to make your way through the book. Or you could just pick it up and say, I know a little bit about Azure, and there's some topics I want to learn about. So now I just want to jump in and do a handful of the chapters through the book. You could certainly do that too.
Now, you've got a part on high availability and scale, but part 4 catches my eye. It's the cool stuff. So what is the cool stuff?
So the cool stuff is what I really wanted to write about and what I wanted to play with, to be quite honest. So you're right. The first couple of sections of the book are really setting the foundations and then getting into high availability, redundancy, how you would do things like backup and security. And then once you get into the last, I guess, 4 or 5 chapters of the book, it's now okay. So you've probably started to look at how I could migrate some existing apps that I have. Now I want to start looking a little bit more towards the future, either for my own company or for my own career growth. I want to look at things like containers. So we get into Azure Container Registry, container instances, Kubernetes service. It looks at artificial intelligence and machine learning. You jump into a little bit of Azure IoT, and then look at things like Azure Logic Apps and Azure Functions. So it's really more kind of those, I wouldn't necessarily say forward-leaning and future stuff. There's a lot of companies that are doing great work with those services, but I guess it's more your transition as you're coming to Azure or you're learning more about Azure. Now I want to start going beyond just lift and shift of applications or just rerunning the same things. What can I do to kind of move my business forward? Okay.
And there's one of the chapters on Azure automation. That's now, of course, we talked a lot about that on the DevOps, the Azure DevOps podcast, and but that's a vast topic. What's the cliff notes?
So we have to take everything with that pinch of salt of we're doing this in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's the same with artificial intelligence, machine learning. You got 45 minutes to become an expert on this. So Azure automation is one where we touch on things like the update service, where we can say, okay, I can onboard a machine, and Azure automation is going to be the back end for then starting to go in and analyze the virtual machine. What updates does it need? And then start to do the automation for actually resolving the updates, doing the reporting back. We look at how you can do both Windows and Linux machines as well. And so that's really what it's touching on, introducing this idea that, hey, you could get a PowerShell script and you could then put that as a playbook, and then you can push that out to your virtual machines, schedule some performance, some maintenance, that needs to go through, and how you can do it in that cross-platform way. So it's kind of a whirlwind introduction, to be honest. And there are other topics, like we don't really get into Azure DevOps at all as the service, or Azure Active Directory as the service. Those are just so broad that to try and cover it in a 45-minute chapter would probably leave people either confused and wanting more, or just lead them down the wrong path. So it's kind of touched on, but it's really focusing on just some of those foundations to give you ideas of what's capable. And then it's like, okay, cool, what do I have in my business right now where I could start to make use of this?
And you said a word that I just want to make sure we define for the listeners. You said playbook. And there's this whole family of historical words, runbooks and such. Yeah. Can you give us the taxonomy of what these things are and how they relate to each other?
Oh, no, I'm almost certainly going to get that wrong. So it should probably be runbook, I guess, within the Azure automation sense. If I would need to go and double check our wonderful docs to confirm, but it should probably be a runbook. But I think within Azure automation, what I was trying to get at within the book is that rather than just writing one big script and then uploading that and saying, okay, here's my one big script, you kind of break it down into little chunks. So you can say, okay, I'm going to have one part of my script that's going to do my authentication part, that's going to be able to log into a virtual machine, and we show how you can create one of the accounts that lets you do that. And then you would have another part of your script that would actually go ahead and execute whatever it is that you want on the virtual machine, and how you can start to tie those together. And that's really the model that I was trying to get to as the quick introduction. But I think runbook is probably the way it should be. Playbook might have been more of like the on-prem SCCM terminology.
Well, just the main point, for developers who come from just coding and have never managed an on-premise data center, the cloud world has said, you know what? Let's use that term. Let's use that on-premise term that's become popular, runbook. But for the programmers out there who are thinking, what's a runbook?
Yeah, it's a little. I think one of the reasons why they tried to keep that terminology was that Azure Automation can also do the hybrid runbook worker, in terms of you can just do Azure Automation purely within the cloud, just within your Azure resources. But using the hybrid runbook worker, you could connect into an on-prem environment, or you could technically connect into another cloud environment even, and then just use that agent to start to push those commands into virtual machines in a different cloud or to physical servers that might be on-prem. So I think that's probably why they had to keep the terminology. Azure Automation came out of a lot of the on-prem System Center components historically. I think it was a lot of the same team that moved into Azure Automation. So that's probably why the same terms carry over.
And you correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I like to think about it is, from a programmer's perspective, it's a job that could be triggered, and it could either be a scheduled run every day time trigger, or it could be, hey, when something happens, trigger it. And then it's just a series of instructions, a series of PowerShell commands to do something on the resource. And
yep, you pretty much got it.
And so for the programmers out there who are thinking, what the heck is a runbook? Well, if we have a server, or if we have a serverless resource, it's just some routines that might need to run based on some things that happen. Whether it's, if something happens, do an exception report or do a backup or any number of things.
Yep. One other thing that's part of Azure Automation that's kind of cool, I guess if you're from the developer background and you maybe don't want to have to manage a lot of the infrastructure side of things, is something called PowerShell desired state configuration, which is where you can define how you want the server you're going to run your application on to be stood up and configured, but you don't necessarily want to have to go in and do it. You don't have to want to then manage that over time if state may change. So you can, as part of Azure Automation, you can define this state using PowerShell DSC, desired state configuration, and then say, okay, every time that the server starts to drift, if someone, for whatever reason on a different team logs in and starts to make some manual changes, you've already said, no, this is how I want my server to be configured. DSC will then go through and can remediate that. And so you don't have to focus on that infrastructure side. You can just focus on your code and application side. So that's why it's a really broad topic. And again, we try and touch on this in 45 minutes, but it's a really cool part that a lot of people, I think, almost get overwhelmed with Azure, because you could be coming from that infrastructure background, or you could be coming from that developer background. How on earth do I use these? Or how does this even apply to me, I suppose? And once you can start to understand some of the options, it's pretty powerful how all these services tie together.
Yeah. And there's still so many legacy applications out there, and they're being lifted and shifted into Azure VMs just to kind of get them in that one spot. And there's still so many complex Windows services that are essentially wrapping a Visual Basic DLL, which are notorious for ghosting, for just, they're running, but they are dead. They're totally dead, non-responsive, but the operating system thinks they're still running. And so over time, people wrote extra code and extra services to detect the ghosting of, the log stream stopped. I think it's ghosted. Let me kill it and let me restart it. And we wrote actual procedural code to do those things. Well, now those types of things can be externalized to an Azure runbook and kind of listen for the same triggering event, and then kill and restart a service or whatever it might need to be.
Yeah, there's nothing necessarily wrong with just lifting and shifting an application, but it's like if you're going through that model, and there's valid reasons, there could be resource constraints, budget constraints where you can't rewrite it, but like you were saying, can you now use some of these services and features in Azure to kind of simplify that a little bit, so you're not having to maintain maybe as much of a mess of this legacy code base?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a blurred line on whether to use runbooks or whether to use some of the application insights features for triggering an event based on queries of the logs, because you can do alerting if it's a monitoring thing, or if something in the logs means, wait a minute, I need to auto scale this service up or down.
Yep. And I think that's why, again, this last section of the book, the cool stuff, where we talk about logic apps and when we talk about Azure functions, like they're almost the next logical step. I don't want to necessarily say there's a transition from these PowerShell scripts and Azure automation to then moving over to something like Azure functions, but it's the same kind of concept in that I just want some code that I would like you, Azure, to execute when a certain event happens, when something is triggered. And so you could use webhooks for that, or like you say, it could be I'm going to be waiting for Azure Monitor to then notice something has happened, or a file has been dropped into an Azure storage account. That could then trigger a logic app or a function. And the difference between the two is logic apps are not quite no code, but it's almost like a drag and drop UI interface where you can start to build different workflows without having to start to write a bunch of code. Azure functions are then, I actually have some code that I would like you to execute. And Azure functions can actually get pretty complicated. It's not just a snippet of, hey, here's 4 or 5 lines of code. You can get more advanced than that. And there's a few different languages that are supported. So again, you could just say, I know using PowerShell, I know how I can do some of this Azure automation stuff, but there are also then logic apps and functions that you could start to lean on, as you might need to be in a little bit more of a transition path where you've got more modern services and you've got those legacy services. Well, is there something I can use that could work across the two?
Yeah. Another one of your chapters is securing information with Azure Key Vault. And with with Azure DevOps, secrets can also be encrypted right there in Azure pipelines, and then kind of poke those through and have maybe a different password or credential per environment. But what are the decision points on where to store a credential when you have these multiple choices?
So I think I would probably be looking at what is the application needing. So you can do secrets that could come through Azure DevOps itself if that's what you were using. But again, if you had more of a legacy application that it's not necessarily being deployed like that, it's already up and running, it's something fairly static, then it still would need some kind of secure access to keys or to secrets, to certificates. It could be something like an Azure Kubernetes service cluster, for example, that again, it's up and running. You might be having some kind of pipeline that would be rolling a new update, a new version of your application. So you're deploying some new pods, but I would probably be looking at, okay, what's my application going to need? It could just be pure VMs. One of the examples that we show in the book is going through and just taking a virtual machine, having that be able to reach into Azure Key Vault to get a secret so that it could then essentially create a connection string to a database. And so even if you're just looking at virtual machines rather than getting into code or any kind of automated deployments, that's where you have a little bit of flexibility there with Key Vault, because you could do certificates, and Key Vault can automatically generate certificates. It can tie in with an external certificate authority, so it could actually sign for real certificates. Or you could just install your own certificates that you've generated yourself or through a third party. So there's maybe a little bit more flexibility with Key Vault. And it could also be if you have compliance reasons. To be quite honest, if you're in financial services, there may be requirements that it has to be stored within a hardware device, so it's got to stay within that hardware security module boundary. Okay.
So backing up to just the simple cases of, there's a service account, and that service account has a username and password, and we need to store it. What's your thought process on just the team workflow of Azure Key Vault versus things like LastPass?
So there maybe is approaching a couple of different things. Key Vault would be more something that a server or a program would be going in and accessing. It wouldn't necessarily be something where, as an end user, you're saying, I need to go and store a username and password that I can then copy and paste into some kind of web-based service when I'm doing it. So LastPass is great for that. I'm a LastPass user for a long time, and there's 1Password, and there's other password managers that do that great for more of a UI environment. Key Vault, I guess in theory, you could do that, but you would have to log into the Azure portal. You would have to then have access to the Key Vault to be able to do it. So in my mind, I would look at, if you're looking at a team environment and you want to control access into web-based services, you would use one of those other applications. Key Vault would then be more, these are just my Azure resources that are wanting to automatically or programmatically connect in and consume these secrets and certificates themselves. It's not an end user that's going in and obtaining those.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
Hey, this is Jeffrey. Do you ever wonder if your software project is on the right path? It's really common for software projects to experience delays, to have the quality not where it needs to be, or have the team spending more time maintaining the software than you really should. In my practice, we know the challenges implementing all parts of DevOps, and it can make your head spin how many things you have to think about, and somewhere in your gut, you know that something's missing. So I've created a comprehensive 30-point DevOps inspection, reviewing your current process, methods, tools, source control, build integration, the various levels of testing, provisioning and maintaining environments, deploying, logging, telemetry, everything you need to think about in a high throughput, high productivity DevOps environment. And it really helps you gain peace of mind knowing that you're on the right track. And we are offering some more of our really popular 30-point DevOps inspections, and it's normally a $5,000 value, but I'm giving it away for free for my podcast listeners. Just send me an email, jeffrey@clear-measure.com. That's Jeffrey. And I'd be happy to inspect your existing DevOps environment, whether you use Azure DevOps Services, Octopus Deploy, TeamCity, any number of tools, because there are a lot out there. But what's important is that you have a complete and automated DevOps environment put together the right way. So get a second pair of eyes. Send me an email. Now, forgive me. I'm just there's so many great topics in this month of lunches, and I feel myself gaining weight because we're having so many lunches here. But at the beginning, you cover Azure networking basics, and I don't know about you, but I see a lot of confusion and out there of thinking, okay, what comes first? Does the application own the networking, or is that a different layer? I'm trying to do infrastructure as code. Where should I put this? Mm-hmm. So what's your advice there?
So the Azure networking basics should probably have been in air quotes, to be honest. And it's fairly early. I think it's chapter 5 in the book. We do virtual machines. We then quick look at web apps. We look a little bit at storage, and then get into networking. And honestly, like from the first edition, and then as we've gone through the second edition, that networking chapter is typically where people say, this takes more than 45 minutes. Yeah. And it's more because they have to reread things a couple of times maybe. And when you're creating these resources, it is often new for people. And it's often because it's not you that's standing up these networking resources, or you stand up network resources once for a given application, but then really the network should be left alone. Exactly the same as in an on-prem environment. If you've worked in an on-prem environment, you're not typically managing network resources day to day. And it is often a different team that's doing that. So I wanted to introduce networking, even though it might not be something people are doing regularly, just so that they have an understanding of what there is. Again, it's to expose what features are available, what services are available, or when you're having to work across these different teams, you know what kind of questions to ask, maybe in terms of, I need this configuration, and you know that it's possible. So if they try and come back and feed you a line of, oh, no, we can't, it's like, no, you can do that. Or in terms of troubleshooting, there's a couple of things like Network Watcher, or there are flow logs that are built into Azure, effective security group rules. There's all these things where even if you don't necessarily know how to troubleshoot networking yourself, because it's not your day job, these features still exist where, again, from a developer perspective, I just want to see, can my two application components communicate with each other? You could look at the flow logs and say, no, they can't. Or you could look at effective security group rules and say, no, they can't. But it should give you a fairly visual indication as to why, just to help speed up that time to resolution without having to wait on a different team. So it is a little bit of a struggle. And a lot of the times in big environments, you will get this kind of separation of resource management. So it's more just an introduction of what's available and how you could work with other people within your environment as needed.
Okay. Now, because we talk about DevOps all the time, infrastructure as code is a huge topic, and oftentimes we see customers asking questions like, "I have an enterprise agreement, but how many subscriptions should I have? Resource groups. Oh, I can segment security by resource group, and I can should I have one subscription for the whole department, for the whole team? Should I have all the way? Should I have a different subscription per server?" I mean, how do you advise people make those types of decisions?
I'm going to give the typical Microsoft consultant answer of it depends.
It depends on?
It depends on what the business requirements are, what type of billing setups you have in place. I would say at the higher level, the main thing that I look at focusing on when it comes to resource governance would be things like, how am I going to be managing the life cycle of an application? So this is before you're necessarily looking at how am I having different subscriptions and different Azure tenants, and there's a whole bunch of different terms in the governance side. I am more look at, okay, you talked about resource groups. Should I have one resource group for everything? Should I have multiple resource groups? They're the kind of things that I would more focus on. And it comes down to, am I wanting to manage the whole application lifecycle as one, in which case typically you're going to be going into one resource group. If you're going to be kind of co-sharing network resources in terms of there's multiple different applications that are all using the same network resources, and I'm just responsible for my set of virtual machines or my Kubernetes cluster or my functions app or whatever, that's when I would start to break it down into different resource groups. Network would have one resource group, storage maybe has another resource group, and then the application components that you manage would be another resource group, and then use things like role-based access controls to control access into those different resources, who can manage them, who could delete them, using things like resource locks to prevent accidental deletion. And that's more where I would be looking at it. In terms of subscription management, that's a little bit more of a higher level. And it's, again, how are you wanting to try and build this? Larger environments typically would be breaking it down maybe by region, geographical region, and then you could have different departments within that, such as finance, HR, engineering, and that makes it a little bit easier to then track when the billing reports come in, if you want to do any kind of chargeback. But that's always one of the difficult points, because there is no real, I would guess, hard and fast answer as to how you approach that subscription and tenant management.
Is there any downside to the side of the spectrum where you have a whole mess of subscriptions and you only have, maybe one or two resource groups per subscription, kind of like moving the segmentation up one level?
I mean, it complicates your management when you're then needing, so if you take a step back, so again, we looked at, okay, make it a little bit easier for billing, but then that could also complicate for billing if you start to get so granular like that in terms of, okay, well, who actually owns this subscription? And someone would have to go ahead and provision that subscription to begin with. And then there's another billing report that's coming through for that subscription. So you can go too far one way. From then just a pure resource management perspective, you then got to, again, be granted access to that subscription. When you're then querying for resources within the Azure portal or the Azure CLI, what subscription am I targeting? You might not get any results back because it's 3 subscriptions over with there's only one resource group there. So you can certainly go a little bit too far. So that's why I typically see broken down in larger organizations by geography and then by department. If it's a little bit of a smaller organization, maybe you just have the one office. Maybe you would break it down even just to production and test, or production and dev, for example. Maybe that's comfortable enough if you only have a small number of employees. I guess you really want to get to the point of, I want to be able to manage my resources without too much overhead.
Yeah.
And so again, that's why it's like, what is your organization's definition for too much overhead?
Got it. Well, your second edition's coming out pretty soon. What are the big changes, or what can people look forward to in the next edition?
So a lot of the things in the second edition are really just updating for how quickly Azure moves. So it's been about 2 years since the first edition came out. And life moves quick in the cloud. So as much as we focus on the core foundations, there are some things that have changed. Cosmos DB, which is the distributed database service, has got some new additions and a new version of the SDK. We then looked at some of the artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's got a new version of the SDK. Things like Azure Storage now has Ultra SSD solid state drive. So there's some new storage performance features that you can benefit from. Azure Kubernetes Service has gone from, it might have even been in preview when the first edition came out, or it had just gone to general availability. Now Azure Kubernetes Service is really fully fledged, and it can do things like virtual machine scale sets and availability zones, which touch on some of those high availability things. So it's really just kind of updating for where the state of Azure is right now. So that is, as you're going through and learning this, again, you're in a good position to know what's available, so that when you start to do things for your own business, you know what you can start to run in Azure. Awesome.
Now, besides this book, you develop a whole lot of other content at Microsoft, right? So,
right.
What are some of the other topics that you've developed?
So right now, the last 6 months or so, I've mainly been focusing on Azure Active Directory. And again, that's a really broad service. So I mostly do Azure Active Directory domain services, as much as a mouthful that is. And then I also do the authentication side. So Azure multi-factor authentication, self-service password reset, some of the passwordless features that are there, password protection. And so there's some really cool new features that are coming up for the RSA conference at the end of February. And then again, as we move into build around the May time, that are going to be coming up. So that's some of the things that I'm working on at the moment. We've been doing some new tutorials. And then Microsoft Learn, if folks haven't seen docs.microsoft.com/learn, that has like interactive learning paths to guide you through different things. And so Azure Active Directory is starting to get some learning paths there as well. And if people are looking at certification too, then it's got some stuff in there on Azure Ready.
Okay, awesome. Well, if people kind of want to dig into Azure, what go-to resources would you point them to? If they finish listening to this podcast and then just needed to go to a web browser, what should they do?
So obviously, other than going and checking out the book, so if you go to azuremol.com, or go to the manning.com website and search for Azure in the month of lunches, the docs.microsoft.com webpage is really probably my main starting point for almost any Microsoft service or product at this point. Docs.microsoft.com has a bunch of content specifically for Azure. It's one of the larger documentation sets that there is. But that's more, I want to learn something very specific. I would say it's more feature-driven, service-driven. So Microsoft Learn is probably a great place to go and get started, because it has those different learning paths as you want to learn a topic. It will guide you through step by step, and you have some videos in there, and you have interactive exercises. There's a free cloud shell, so you're not even having to have your own Azure subscription. You can use some of that built-in free resources available and pick something that you want to learn. They've got gamification for badges and things like that, if you want to try and compete with your friends and things like that. So docs.microsoft.com website is pretty expensive, and that's a really good place to start to dive into some of these Azure services that you find interesting. Okay,
awesome. Now, I believe that goes to the early access program for the second edition. For the MEEP, would you recommend that people wait for the edition, or are there advantages to jumping on to the early access program for Manning?
So Manning actually does it really cool with the Manning Early Access program, in that you'll essentially get the chapters of the book as they're made available. And so all 21 chapters should be available now. The website may not have updated to reflect that, but you also get the first edition of the book, the complete first edition of the book anyway. And like I said, within the next month or so, then that whole second edition that's gone through this production phase of copy editing and proofreading and whatever else should be out. But I was pretty comfortable with the way that the second edition manuscript turned out. There wasn't a ton of copy editing that went into it, thankfully. There wasn't an awful lot of red lines that went through things. So if you go ahead and pick up what's available in that early access program, it's actually pretty darn close to what the polished version will be. It'll at least give you an idea as to what there is. And then certainly if you wanted to wait for that final version, you can. And with Manning, if you buy the physical version, you automatically get the digital version. Or if you just wanted to get the ebook version, then you can go ahead and do that.
Nice. Awesome. And finally, you have probably encountered this a number of times. You're creating so many Azure resources, and then you're filling up your subscription, and then need to get rid of stuff. Do you have a go-to PowerShell script or something that just clears out your subscription in bulk without having to click and delete on everything?
So I'm actually a little bit OCD in that I delete things as pretty methodically as I go. And that's one thing that's called out in the book, is delete things as you go. And that ties into one of the earlier questions on how do you manage resource groups. And if you put things in a certain resource group, then it's fairly safe to delete that whole resource group when you're done. So I honestly don't really have anything in my back pocket that would just go out and just blast something away. You certainly could, in 2 or 3 lines of PowerShell, probably just get all resource groups, delete all resource groups, and say yes, confirm. But yeah, I've never let my subscription get to that level. There are some MVPs, Microsoft Valuable Professionals, in the community that are going through this thing right now of Azure Spring Clean. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of what they're touching on is, hey, this might be a good time to go and look in your Azure subscription and try and find things that you've had running that are burning a whole bunch of money off that's not really needed anymore. But yeah, I always try and stick in the idea of keep things clean as you go. The bigger the team you work in, the harder that becomes. But if you at least can try and keep that clean, then hopefully you don't need to go complete nuclear and just remove everything in a subscription.
Yeah. Well, the surprise bills, I don't think anybody who's used the subscription pay-as-you-go resources have definitely received a surprise bill.
Yep, and I have as well. It does still happen, but there are now things like cost alerts that you can put into Azure, so you can get some kind of notification. For virtual machines, you can do automatic shutdown, and I think it's a default option through the portal to automatically shut down at 7 p.m. Zulu time. So there are some things that are now built into Azure to try and get ahead of those unexpected bills. But yeah, try and keep it clean as you go, and try and encourage other folks in your team to do the same thing too.
Awesome. Well, Iain, this has been a great learning experience for me, and I'm sure for the listeners. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's a lot of fun. I enjoy talking about Azure, and hope everyone has a lot of fun as they start digging into things.
Great. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.